So a few years ago I went to work in the European Commission, and I was told when I arrived, you're going to have to, your job is to find out evidence about how innovative new things in the field of social care for old people, so that we can take this evidence to policy. And I don't really know anything about any of those things, but this word evidence, I just became my whole life. And when I came back here, I ended up teaching about 30 hours of courses around this topic, and I'm trying to sort of work out some sort of research program around this concept of evidence, because I think there's lots of interesting things. So what I'm going to do is give like a brief version of the talk that I give, introductory talk in a lot of the courses I give, and then some thoughts about how IT and comes into this, but we've actually heard quite a lot yesterday on this topic. So here's a typical Sherlock Holmesian idea of evidence, the bloody pamphlet. I'm going to go something a bit more sophisticated. I'm going to introduce ideas of what I think evidence processes, evidence as a verb as well as a noun, and then I'm trying to work on ideas of practices, spaces, and regimes. Here's another sort of typical things we know as evidence. I think that's all right. Nobody in my classes knows what this is. I hope everyone here knows what this graph is. Does anyone not know what it is? The hockey stick? Yeah, one of the most famous bits of visual evidence in the last 20 years. So this is the sort of thing we're interested in. These you'll recognise. This is a discredited form of evidence in the justice system, and these sorts of things. These days you never believe them anyway. And then of course this being the new sort of evidence. How popular is this guy? Is it true what he says? Who believes it, etc., etc. So my concern is to understand and critically engage with how you're creating new forms of informatized digital evidence processes, how they become legitimized, how they become developed, how they become integrated into different areas of life. And I've kind of realized that this evidence is a fundamental socio-technical concept, and thus very interesting, and not really studied in a comprehensive way from an STS perspective, or any perspective. Why it's interesting, everything now is evidence-based, or as Ben was telling me yesterday in the Scottish Government, evidence-informed, no longer based, just informed. We've got lots of challenges to the quality of evidence in science now. Nobody believes any psychology experiments anymore. If you want to get evidence in physics, you have to spend tens of billions of dollars building big machines. We're getting lots of new sorts of evidence production technologies and processes. We've got new ways to circulate it and exchange it. And of course, in the last year, everyone's gone mad about fake news. And this is making us really think about what it is we believe and why. A quote here from a study from nursing studies, which I'll explain why that's important in a minute. If you have a look, evidence may be one of the most fashionable words in healthcare. And healthcare, you can include a lot of other things. The discourse embraces various permutations, including evidence-based practice, evidence-based nursing, evidence-based guidelines, evidence-based decision-making, etc., etc. The substantial investment in infrastructure, of course, that's the buzzword for us, and significant challenges on what evidence is. So these are all sorts of things that you see all over the evidence, all over the literature, particularly in areas of practice where people have been told produce and use evidence. I'm going to go into this a bit later, but here's the sort of things I'm thinking about when we come to 21st century data-based evidence, big data, new sorts of visualizations, open data, social media, etc., etc. Lots of different sorts of literature, but nothing that really covers everything. I started in the policy literature, I was working down through law and philosophy and kind of science studies. There's lots of work to do to pull these sorts of things together. Okay, so some kind of basic idea is that we use evidence for different things, particularly as a resource for decision making, when we don't when there's contested issues or we don't know what to do. We do it in law, obviously, that's the place where we most think of evidence, in everyday life, in design processes. I was working with Arno for 3 years, developing courses on that bring together evidence and design processes and how they link together. And we can use them in a kind of one-off, or we can use a continual way. Either there's a big decision we need evidence to decide, or should I take a raincoat today? I look out the window and I check my phone, and I do that every day. we do things like reduce uncertainty. Should I take a coat or not? Okay, look for some, what evidence do I bring? We use it to shape opinion. You should be thinking this. That's in the political domain. We use it to legitimize a decision. Politicians often do that. Or a lack of decision. Oh, we don't have enough evidence. Let's have another inquiry and we'll decide that in 2 years' time. Happens all the time. Handle contested issues. Of course, the court case is again the place where we see that most, but also in science, there's considerable issues around there. To calculate value, what's the evidence we use to calculate the value in the market when we're buying something, whatever. And in the kind of bit more philosophical phrase, to as part of truth criteria, how do we have a justified belief about something? Essentially, it's an empiricist approach. I think most of us would accept that we should have evidence. Naturally, Edinburgh being the home of evidence-based natural philosophy, all these areas have gone evidence-based in the last few years and are struggling to make it work. The alternative to evidence, of course, is power. If you don't have evidence, the decisions are made by who's the strongest or who's been there the longest and has the entrenched positions. So this is the counterpoint to use of evidence is very much the power concept. So it brings it into the world of politics very clearly. So the word evidence is about making something obvious, incontestable, to make evidence. So you look at a graph and say, well, that's obvious that the temperatures have gone up since human beings started pumping out CO2. It's obvious that that person is the criminal. These are really clear. So the idea of evidence is not only that it's cleverly constructed by methodology, but the way it's presented makes things incontestable. So how do we make something evident? We can visualize it with a picture, a graph. We can put it into a story, a chain of hypotheses with evidence linked together. That becomes very powerful. A motive. Who do we get to present the evidence? We know that in court cases, when you're awarding damages, if you get the crying mother, there's more damages than if you don't. You have it linked to a theory, very much a scientific approach. If the evidence is linked to theory, very much more powerful. Statistical tests are really important. This is one of the problems in psychology, is that we rely on a lot of statistical tests. They're very powerful, but they can also be misread and misused. And then we have endorsements of authority, or eminence, or all sorts of different sorts of experts that we know is typical science study sort of thing. I'm interested in these ideas of evidence bases and practices. But evidence is a social process, and that's really clear. When the courtroom organising of the analyst meeting is a social process, and they can become established in practice. A key thing that I learned in the policy domain, evidence has to be provided at the right time, in the right place, in the right form, so that it can be used by those making decisions, and it's got to be legitimised. It's got to be legitimised. This is a really important issue. It's no good just coming out with a nice study and discovering that actually a decision about that thing was made yesterday. And what they wanted was a half-page brief with some big numbers, and your big fat report, no one's ever going to read it. Okay. So we've got a lot of different evidence processes, authority, evidence rules, creation of legitimacy criteria. These are things I'm kind of trying to explore at the moment. What does it mean to create legitimate evidence? How are those processes done in different fields? How how do we weigh and balance, what are the different mechanisms that we put in place to balance evidence? What are the timetables to bringing evidence to the place that it is required? All these sorts of things you'll see in different domains. And and these are sorts of places you'll bring them to, like the courtroom, like putting them into the magic quadrant that Neil and Robin have worked on, like the laboratory, like the blogosphere. These are all these sort of spaces of evidence. And once they're created, these evidence objects will then circulate around. And they can be controlled, but often not controlled. And I found that one of the things you produce a really good graph with an explanation and some big numbers, and in a long PowerPoint presentation. And the aim was to get your boss to take some of those slides and get them into their presentation, and then to get their boss to get them into their presentation. And slowly this slide with this bit of evidence circulates as a very powerful thing. And the big number, the graph, the slide, the photo, these are all key sorts of evidence that can enter into circulation. Because these things go wrong, evidence is really expensive to produce, good evidence. Most of the evidence we produce is pretty rubbish because we don't have the money or time, we don't have the expertise to produce good evidence. There's, the legitimizing agents can often lose credibility. So you find what was seen as credible at one time loses its way. And of course, it's misused all the time. We don't critically examine evidence. People deliberately misrepresent it, they fabricate it, and they don't know how to use the right test. There's lots of things that go wrong in evidence processes. Okay. I actually have 15 minutes because I thought I'd take a bit.
Yeah, go on.
I'll go through that time. So basically, I'm trying to do a kind of an overview. You look at how philosophy addresses evidence as a key issue in epistemology, but it's also the ontology of the evidence object is really important. And there's a whole kind of literature on what is a fact, what is data, what is proof. Each one of these you take for granted, actually, they're more and more complicated. So evidence, it's just facts. Okay, but what are facts? Sociology is science and sociology of knowledge. They have contributed to this kind of what they call a naturalistic turn in epistemology, and also the shift to kind of the Bayesian approach and an exploration in philosophy of different sets of epistemic norms that exist in different kind of areas of life. Here's the kind of four main areas that I'm trying to join up. So science studies, we will study science, we will learn about these things, and we will study these sorts of issues. In law, they have very similar issues. There's a whole literature on evidence, rules, admissibility, witness, testimony, process of cross-examination, all these sorts of issues. And then we have these things called evidence-based. All these things I've tried to borrow ideas from over here, and I include social science and humanities in here, because lots of social science is not very evidence-based. Here, instead of, a lot of the things in science we take for granted, over here it's much more about pluralism, about routines and tradition. There's very common techniques like ranking are really common processes that aren't used over here. And then of course we have evidence in everyday life, things we do all the time. We use our senses, we have our habits for what we check. We use the media, social media, our access to local experts to tell us what we should be thinking. And these days it's the quantified self. Actually, we're looking for lots of new kind of digital evidence about ourselves and our body. In STS, I think you know all these sorts of things about how knowledge and evidence works. In science studies, but also in technology innovation studies, there's been concern for certain sorts of evidence, like running code, I think was mentioned yesterday. We've studied a lot about evidence about users and markets and how that circulates in an arena of innovation. And then how evidence is used in practice in the process of innovation and technology development. In law, they have similar sorts of ideas, probably less familiar to many of you. They have all these when is evidence legitimate, when it is admissible in court. What's the role of the experts? This is very familiar science studies ground. But the legal profession is saying the way we deal with evidence is stuck in the 19th century. In the US, 10 years ago, they started a complete review of how they manage evidence in the light of the new techniques and new technologies. Said most of the old techniques and taken for granted assumptions about what counts as evidence has to be thrown out. The Advocate General in Scotland says, why are we still bringing people together into a courtroom to be cross-examined? And I was on a jury service, and there was the court case, and there's been a fight basically 2 years before. Nobody could remember anything much about it, clearly. And this is sort of thing saying, why can't we just video people and record their testimony right after the events? Because by the time they get to court, 2 years later, the remembrance of it is very vague. So there's a concern that we should be using new technology to update the 19th century idea of the justice process. If you go into medicine, they have this idea of hierarchies of evidence. Of course, who is in control? This is also been highly criticised and worked on. This is where the nursing studies comes in, because the nursing people are down here somewhere, and the medical research are up here, and their social hierarchy as well as the hierarchy of evidence. Okay, in the data age, this is to wrap up, and I think everyone else is talking about these sorts of things. We have all these, we're looking for evidence personally. What do? We go and Google. We Google it. That's the modern way we like. What's the evidence about what's going on? We Google it, Wikipedia, Twitter, Reddit, AdWords if you're in a business, check the mail online, go and check out a bunch of YouTube videos to see how something should be done. These are evidence processes that we've taken on. In the kind of bigger area of innovation and science, we want to use our theoretical knowledge of informatization to see how these evidence processes are changing. We'd expect to see issues of measurement, quantification, standardization, infrastructure, automation coming up in all fields. And in fact, this is what we do see. We'd also expect to see bricolage, creativity, generativity of new ways of doing things on the new IT platforms. And we'd expect to see changing economics of evidence as the way produced evidence changes, new power structures and new governance regimes emerging. These are some of the sorts of tools we can see. Big data, computers that can compute things much more quickly, AI, social media, new verification tools coming in, such as blockchain or crowdsourcing, new evaluation tools, it's all the algorithms, and new ways of visualizing things and communicating things, evidence in different domains. Dashboards, for example, was one we talked about yesterday. So we're changing the space of evidence. We're reinventing new forms of legitimacy and authority in blog spheres, in changing the courtroom, all these different sorts of things. And we're also this process of massification, and some people call it democratization, where we can all take pictures of the crime. We can all collect data using our smartphones, and we can share the open data. New people can become experts. Big data, I think we talked about that yesterday, and we're going to do this. The algorithm, this is a big concern now. We're using algorithms as a way to judge risk, to judge entitlement of benefits, to make our consumer decisions, to shape our personal business reputation. These are all bring together these electronic forms of evidence and process them and put out like a big number, a ranking. And we're all subject to these sorts of things now. Okay. So, on the one hand, we can say it's the computer makes a decision, the computer says no, or no, it's a much more sophisticated thing. So I want to finish up saying, I'm doing 2 projects now that I've really been working on the last 4 or 5 years that continue to develop, that will explore different aspects of this. And then I have some questions about what is the boundary between an evidence object and evidence process? What is the value of working on an evidence concept in STS? How can we learn about evidence practices between these different domains? How do we study the technologies and infrastructures of evidence? All these sorts of things I think are really interesting, and the rest of the talks today are touching on these things. So sorry for going on a bit much, but I've got a lot to say. Okay.